Welcome and good morning to the Brattleboro Citizens Breakfast. Today we have Tristan Tolino, who is the state representative for Brattleboro District 3. He has a seat on the Agriculture Committee of the House. One of the pieces of legislation considered there this year was the GMO labeling bill. And there's a GMO labeling bill in Maine and Connecticut. So this looks like a wave. It did pass the House by an overwhelming 99-42 vote, but it's in the Senate next year, so maybe Tristan can take it from there and tell us where do we go with Right to Know from here.
Good morning, thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? My voice is a little crackly this morning, so I apologize for that. So the House Agriculture Committee was tasked with taking the GMO bill back up again. One of the interesting things is that they had actually done this work last year, but last year was the second year of the 2-year biennium schedule in Vermont. And so what happens is that all of the bills that have been introduced over the 2-year period, if they haven't completed the process of becoming law at the end of the biennium, they disappear and you start over from scratch. And so this bill, they took hours and hours of testimony, drafted a piece of legislation, and got it out of the House Agriculture Committee, and then it went to a different committee, and I can't remember, maybe Judiciary, and sat there, and then the session ended and it died. So there was talk earlier in the session about how to take up the new bill that was introduced and how to hopefully push it further forward, and the context in which we did that was awareness that there is an active national energy around this issue. There were 30 state legislatures that were considering some version of a Right to Know bill. So we knew we weren't alone. We knew we'd done a lot of work in the previous session, but it also became a fairly open question as to whether or not any of the other committees besides the House Agriculture Committee would have the time this particular year to give the bill the work that it needed to get to the House floor. So it took us about 6 weeks, not the only thing we did for that 6 weeks, but it was a substantial part of the work of our committee this session. And our process was to start with a draft that was essentially the finished product last year. And then we brought in a pretty wide range of testimony from experts on both sides of the issue and advocates from both sides of the issue. And what we were particularly interested in was hearing from Vermonters who felt that this bill would impact them one way or the other. So the Vermont Specialty Food Producers, we heard from several different members of that association. That's an example of an organization that really covers primarily food, specialty food people. There are some beverage people and others in there, but primarily specialty foods itself. And some of them see opportunity and some of them see risk. And that framing of this piece, whatever happens with Right to Know laws, some see opportunity, some see risk, is something that I used when I presented the bill on the House floor, and I think is an important concept to hold on to as we talk a little bit about the substance of the bill, which is just that it isn't a black and white issue across any sector. There are parts of this that may be really challenging for some businesses, and there are parts of it that may be really rich opportunities. And so stepping back, we heard testimony from a wide range of people. We heard from dairy, we heard from the specialty food industry, we heard from UVM professors, we heard from some members of the religious community, some from environmentalist groups. The idea was from various business lobbies, the dairy industry, conventional dairy industry is very anxious about this legislation, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I think the reason they're anxious is not because of our bill per se, but because of the potential of what a groundswell against GMOs might mean for the conventional dairy industry, which really at this point is completely dependent on GMO crops for feed. And so, we kept saying, our bill doesn't actually address that, and they said, we know that, but we're worried. And so that was, that's a powerful lobby in the state of Vermont. A lot of folks will listen to them because of both the political kind of ramifications for their votes, but also because that sector is sort of iconic in the state. So after having sort of gone through the whole process of hearing as wide a range as we could of testimony, we went back to the original draft of the bill and decided to try to fix what we thought were weaknesses. And that involved really clarifying our findings and stripping out a lot of the value-laden language that had been in the first draft. So if you have looked at the text of it, our findings are very fact-based, very much not drawing definitive conclusions in the findings, but acknowledging that, for instance, that the uncertainty around the science is itself a potential issue for Vermonters, and it's not. We didn't want to be in the position of saying we believe the critics or we believe the supporters on the science, but rather acknowledging that the fact that the science is contested indicates that there is a potential risk for the state of Vermont. And so that brings me to what is really the most important issue going forward, and I think what will be probably a much more interesting and difficult fight in the Senate than it was in the House. Because ultimately, by the time it got to the House floor and had been debated a little bit, as Bob said, the vote was fairly strongly in support of the legislation. That said, the real challenge for any of these bills in any state is a legal challenge from the genetically engineered community, if you will. Monsanto is the lead bogeyman in this case, but there are others. And the grounds upon which they are most likely to sue is a First Amendment challenge. There are a couple other possible legal challenges. We think that, at least in Vermont, our law addresses those. And I will say that we attempted to address the First Amendment issue, and I'm going to try to explain what that is and then wrap up fairly quickly for questions. But basically, a right-to-know bill that requires labeling is a restriction of commercial speech. And so the question isn't if it's a restriction of commercial speech. It is, I believe, quite clearly a restriction of commercial speech. The question is whether it meets one of two tests that have been developed in the legal system for restrictions of commercial speech. And they're the Zauderer and the Hudson test, and there's technical differences between them, but suffice it to say that the fundamental question that we had to ask is, is there a substantial state interest in restricting commercial speech in this context? And so our findings and our process and our language of our bill was designed to address what was the conclusion of the majority of our committee, that yes, there is a substantial state interest in restricting commercial speech in this area because of the potential risk to Vermonters on potential health risks, potential ecological risks, the impact on religious communities where gene blending has potential ramifications for their religious practices. So we looked at, basically, we said, so what, where does the state have an interest in intervening in this process? How is that grounded in the testimony that we heard? So we anchored that testimony and that concept in the findings. And so if you look at the bill, I think you'll see in the findings our argument for why we think that Vermont should take this step and restrict commercial speech knowingly, restrict commercial speech, but with trying to balance the right to the free speech in that context with what we think is the needs of Vermonters. And we know from opinion polls and such that Vermonters largely support us on that. They want to know. What is really important to know about this is that the courts have already ruled against Vermont on the BGH, the BHT, the growth hormone, many 15 years ago or something, and they found that there's no what do they call it? There's no protection for consumer curiosity. So the question is this consumer curiosity, or is this potential harm to Vermonters? And so that's where the legal battle will be fought if we pass this and it get, and then we get sued. And in the Senate, where this goes next, I think that the lobbying effort will be vigorous, to say the least, because it's going to be about whether Vermonters have a stomach to lose a lawsuit or not. And that's what's going to come up over and over again. Are you willing to spend $5 million to try to win this? What happens if we lose? There's a lot of people who think that passing a bill that we know will be challenged legally is a mistake. And so I think if you're interested in this issue as an advocate, you want to be looking at the Senate and sort of supporting them in having the clarity of vision to know that it's possible to have crafted a piece of legislation that would be challenged legally, but that has a defensible argument. You are the lead attorney for Legislative Counsel talked about a pathway to constitutionality. That we crafted this piece of legislation with the constitutional questions in mind, but we're not a court of law. It will be ultimately decided whether we hit that balance correctly or not by somebody else. And so the political question becomes whether the Senate has the conviction around this issue at the same level as the House, and whether they're willing to put Vermont on a path to face that legal challenge and to face it knowingly. Frankly, there may be additional compromises that slip into the bill as a way of trying to mitigate for some what an affirmative vote would mean in terms of that lawsuit. And there are exemptions in the bill that you may have heard about that people raise questions about. Dairy products are exempted, and cheese products are exempted, and meat is exempted. And there's questions as to why, and I'll just touch on that one piece, and then I'll open up for questions. If there's more questions about the detail of that, let me know. The line that we drew was the products that use ingredients that were themselves genetically engineered and not sort of secondary step products. So animals that have fed on corn that has been genetically engineered, the meat would be exempted. But if a food product uses the corn itself in whole or in part, it's not exempted. And so that was the boundary line we drew of saying that, and I guess I would say that the potential harm seemed to be, the evidence seemed to suggest more clearly that the potential harm comes from the products themselves, not so much when the products are used as feed in the process. Not that there may never emerge that the standard needs to be higher than that, but that at this moment that's the line that we drew. So I'll open up for questions, and we can start with the GMO, bill. But if there's more of interest to you, there are other things that I've been involved in. If you have any questions about any of the big issues, happy to take questions there. And what I'll do is I'll try to repeat the question back to you since we don't have my mic. Yes, Judy?
One of the questions I have is, I think this bill delayed the implementation of the bill for a couple of years, and I thought that was probably because wanting to gain support from other states, and so that you would have companionship in actually fighting a suit for Monsanto. Is that some of the thinking, and is that where the bill is going? You know, to try and wait till you have enough states to do this together in some kind of class action or whatever?
So the question is about the implementation of the bill and the delay in the implementation of the bill. The version last year had a trigger clause and a delay, where if two states went first, then ours would go fast behind them. And all of those, and Connecticut has a trigger, and I don't know if the Maine bill does have a trigger or not. We actually, our bill doesn't have a trigger, but it does have a delay. So that was actually a stronger statement. We said this is coming. Whether, you know, if our bill passes, there's a date certain this is coming. And, all of the trigger clauses, and I think the Senate, that's an area where the Senate, if they feel too much pressure about the potential lawsuit, might try to put in a trigger, because no one wants to be first in line for a lawsuit. And so the question is, you know, does that mean that they win, essentially? And I think what I've heard from Vermonters in both in testimony and certainly the level of interest in this particular piece of legislation was off the charts, is that Vermonters aren't necessarily looking for us to wait. But the trigger clause concept is definitely all about sort of managing the fear of the lawsuit. And the date certain with the delay allows producers who use genetically modified ingredients or genetically engineered ingredients to have some time to adapt their formulas. And it's not, depending on what you use, it's not always that easy to procure non-GE ingredients. It's not impossible. And we heard testimony from some businesses who said, you know, hey, it's been a piece of cake for us, and we're excited and we're moving that direction anyway. We heard from others who had a high level of anxiety about whether that would be possible for them to do if the time frame was too quick. So it was trying to balance, you know, the legitimate needs of Vermont businesses to address labeling issues, because if you produce your product for Vermont only, then you can label knowing what the Vermont law is, but if you sell outside of the state of Vermont where they don't require this labeling, it might be a detriment to you on the shelves. If you have GE ingredients and your competitors don't have to label, but you're labeling because it's in Vermont. So you know, there's some complications around how to make this bill be as friendly as possible to the businesses that have to adapt, while moving us on a very deliberate path forward, as opposed to one that's triggered by somebody else going first. Yes?
I'm assuming that the reluctance to engage in a lawsuit is primarily about cost. Is there any possibility of doing a national fundraising campaign to help Vermont cover those costs?
So the question was, is there a way to help raise the money outside of the state to fund a potential lawsuit? Interestingly, we had an advocate who said, you guys are going first, you know, if you get to the end first, you know, we could raise $1 million in a day to help support a legal fund for the state of Vermont. I don't know to what extent that would be politically viable. That's a question I don't know the answer to. What I can say is that I think money, the fear of the lawsuit is very, very much based on money and very much in the minds of some people in the legislature. And without saying too much, I would say that, frankly, that the Entergy legal battles are probably the #1 source of anxiety for people. That there's concern about the cost of that and the losses that we've sustained in our legal arguments so far, and so that people see it in that context. Not everybody does, and I'll offer a different context that I think has merit, which is that our Attorney General's office is engaged in the process of being a participant in lawsuits all the time. That's what they do, among other things. And on an average year, they win some, they lose some, and the average revenue that they bring into the state over the last decade has been about $35 million a year in wins. But sometimes they lose. So is the context, we should never do anything that might lose, because we might lose and spend some money? Or is the context, part of the legal system is that you win some, you lose some, but overall, how are we doing? And if we're doing, reasonably well overall, then, you move forward with the best of intentions, the best legal advice you can get, and, you let the process sort itself out. And I prefer that framing. I think that that's the appropriate framing for this bill. We know what the issues are. We've done our best to address them in a constitutional way that also meets what Vermonters are asking of us. And, we're going to ask our Attorney General's office to do its job. And in the context of what they do, they're very good. But sometimes they lose. And, if they lose, it will cost us some money. But that's part of sort of the cost of doing business as a state is to go through that process.
I have a question about the labeling. Campbell's Soup or Heinz, they're going to have a separate label for the states that have this law apart from the rest of the country?
Yeah, so the question is about labeling and how manufacturers who sell in different states would have to handle that question, or handle the labeling. So this is one of the reasons why the companies will say, well, we don't mind labeling so much, we just want it to be a uniform national standard. Now, I certainly get that, because yeah, there are going to be challenges, logistics challenges for companies that sell in 50 states to figure out what the labeling requirements are. That said, there are already a variety of different labeling requirements in different states on other issues, and they have to adapt to that. And one of the things that we did was we recognized that that is a challenge, and we allowed the Attorney General the discretion to design the labeling requirements in a way that would make it easier for compliance. So, for instance, if you're Campbell's Soup, it might be that your product is stickered in Vermont with a sticker that meets the Vermont requirements, rather than having to have a whole separate product run and separate sort of labeling. That a sticker would allow for that transition. I mean, the concept is, we want the information in front of the consumers, and we know that the more friction there is for businesses, manufacturers, to meet that compliance, the more resistance we will get politically. So we want it to be easy for them to accomplish, because then that puts the information in the hands of the consumers who can avoid the harms that we've identified as of legitimate concern to the state of Vermont. Yes?
It sounds like the suit is way up there, number one, as far as issues that the Senate will need to think about, and the cross-state labeling is another. Can you cite a couple of other issues that the Senate that are sticking points for the Senate?
Sure. So the question is what other sticking points there might be for the Senate beyond the question of cross-state labeling and the lawsuit. So the exemptions arena, what is exempt and what is not. I expect that there will be a push from baby formula manufacturers who don't have very much GE foods in their product, but they do have oils, and they have an argument. They want a piece of language that exempts their baby formulas from the labeling requirement, because the oil has the proteins, the unique proteins that are created through GE are filtered out. So they want that exemption stuck in there. And there may be others. The challenge there is canola oil is one of the most prominent GE products that's used across specialty foods. And if you exempt the formula manufacturers because of the concept that the novel proteins, unique proteins that the GE process creates are stripped out, then you could make a similar argument that canola oil in general should be exempted, and then it starts to chip away at the underlying logic and sort of the practicality. So that it's not specifically a Trojan horse, but it's one that could have profound consequences and will come up. I mean, I think one of the, this is only my first session, so my political analysis-ometer is still being developed here. But one of the things that I noted is that the lobbyist press against us wasn't that strong in the House after the first couple weeks. So that says to me that they know where the battle will be. The battle will be in the Senate. So they were content to let it go to that phase. Now, if they don't battle in the Senate, it's because the corporate entities that are behind those lobbying efforts are comfortable fighting this out in a court of law. But you look at the activity level and what where they are pointing themselves, and that kind of gives a clue as to their strategy. And in this case, I think if they look for them to be very active in the Senate around those issues, exemptions, uniformity of labeling, money cost of the lawsuit. Those are the three big ones, for sure. Yes.
It sounds like you've done a lot of real good due diligence and research on all aspects of the issue. I wonder if in that you took a company like Monsanto itself and looked at how many times they've been challenged and whether they've won or lost. I mean, that's sort of a silly kind of thing in a way, but I know that the canola farmer, Percy Steinmeister, or however you say his name, out in Saskatchewan or wherever he's from, I mean, he spent a lot of money with a lot of support and still didn't win in many, many courts.
Sure.
And sometimes, I mean, that could feel really overwhelming and affect that. So I'm just wondering if looking at any of these companies, what the results have been of the challenges.
Does that mean correctly? So the question had to do with whether we looked at sort of the other legal cases involving GE manufacturers. We talked about them a little bit, but our particular legal challenge hinges on this commercial speech question primarily, and that itself has not been tested in the United States. And it is, some version of this is active in 31 countries, I think, in Europe. So this is not new. In fact, many of the multinational companies that dominate the food industry have whole product lines that are substantially equivalent to the U.S. product lines that are formulated to meet the European market standards. So they know how to make Oreos that meet that standard. They just don't do it here. And I'm sure you all know this, but actually I did this once. I think the top 100 food and beverage companies in the world are roughly 1/60th of the world economy in annual sales. So just to put that in perspective, Nestle and Pepsi are the 1 and 2, and their annual sales are combined are around $60 billion in total sales every year. So the top 10 or so take a huge slice of the global food market. The top 100, a huge slice of the global economy. They're operating at scales. They know what's going on. So, but in terms of the actual comparison to other legal issues, I think our particular legal issue is going to be fought on speech, and that's for us in the U.S.
I'm still formulating my question.
Okay.
Because I'm not sure it's a question as much as a statement. Somebody needs to take this on, and I'm delighted Vermont is doing it. I don't understand why a commercial enterprise, a corporation, has commercial free speech rights as opposed to my right to know what I'm eating and putting in my body. I have the right not to buy their product. The only way I can exercise that right is by knowing what is in there. Most of Europe has already outlawed all the GMO products completely, period. They don't want to even discuss it. We have become the dumping ground. Somebody has got to take this on. It has to start somewhere. If we are successful in getting this highly watered-down bill, in my opinion, passed, which is a good starting point, how do we move on from there? So it's like two questions. Is how does a corporation's free speech right trump mine? And where do we go from here if we are successful in getting it passed?
So, there are a couple questions there. I'm not going to try to repeat them. I'm just going to try to answer them because I don't know how to reformulate them quickly. But going to this question of how does commercial speech trump your right to know? The heart of the question is, so the First Amendment rights have been applied to corporations over a long period of time in incremental ways, but in ways that have been supported by the Supreme Court at every turn. And so we have, if you will, I mean, that's a very powerful legal position for commercial speech. If you know, for commercial speech to defend itself is a relatively easy challenge. The question becomes, you know, when can commercial speech be limited, and under what conditions, and for whose interests? And I think your question goes to that. Why is your interest in knowing what you're eating less important than the ability of a company to sort of have the freedom of speech to market itself as it chooses? And basically, the way that the court test is written is if the state or the federal government can prove, or successfully prove, that there's real legitimate potential harm to you that serves the state interest, then they can limit it. And if they can't, if it's a situation where that legal argument is not successful, then then your right in this case is trumped by their right. And so the test hinges around harm and what is a substantial state interest in this context. And that's one of the reasons why the GE industry is so active in squashing independent research and squashing any challenging research, because those research paths establish the beginnings of an argument that there might be real substantial state interest in helping consumers make choices around those products. That doesn't exist now. What was the second part of your question? Because I haven't.
Should you actually get this passed through the Senate?
Yeah.
Would it be a springboard for trying to get more restrictive? I mean, right now you've got exemptions for this, you've got exemptions for that. Vermont's known for its dairy products and its wholesomeness, and we're putting products in a version that's almost like secondhand smoke. Oh, well, it's okay because the pig ate it or the cow ate it. No, it's not all right. And
so what? Yeah.
Can we use this to go further?
So here's where I might diverge in a way that you weren't anticipating. But part of my background is that I went through the Marlborough College MBA program, a sustainability-focused MBA program. And so I'm sort of focused on the power of business for social change as something that I think is really relevant here. And what I think is going to happen, the legal argument itself is really complex. It's going to take a long time to play out. So let's say the Vermont Senate passes this next year, the governor signs it next year, we get sued right away. It could take 5 to 10 years for that process to play out. But what I think is already happening as a result of the national efforts to build in state legislatures around the country interest in these issues is that the business community that sees opportunity is trying to take advantage of that interest from consumers. And so Whole Foods announcing that they are giving their suppliers a certain period of time to handle this issue, that has tremendous pull on markets. And so I think what we'll see, I hope, is that the change will come actually in the private sector through consumer activity, and choice, that is sort of catalyzed by the legal efforts, so that it's a two-part process. However, you know, your question goes to, that's the fear, right, of the conventional dairy industry in Vermont, is that exactly that what the secret agenda is to take all of their crops away from them. And I would say that at this point, I'm sure that legislation would be introduced as soon as we passed the labeling bill. I'm sure that there would be immediate attempts to make it stronger. I also think that the political will would be pretty muted, in the same way that right now the Vermont Yankee Energy issue is really muted in the legislature because it's currently being contested in the legal system. You know, that it's hard to get the energy and enthusiasm to work on a piece of legislation that directly is impacted by an active lawsuit. So, you know, I think that the constraint would happen there, but really, fundamentally, what I think we really want is for businesses to say, this is in our interest to become GE-free, label ourselves as such, and take advantage of what is a very strong consumer demand, because there's another piece of this that's a real threat to this whole movement, which is that the reason these laws can happen is that the FDA has not chosen to regulate in this arena, because they consider GE foods to be substantially similar to the traditional foods that are generally regarded as safe. That's a technical term. They haven't intervened. But if the, say, 5 state legislatures around the country start to do something, and the companies that have currently said, we don't need labeling, we don't want labeling, we don't want the FDA behind us, well, they have a tremendous amount of influence on the FDA. They could go to the FDA and say, give us a rule, a national rule that we can live with. And then they'll focus on watering down that rule. And then that rule preempts everything the state legislatures around the country are trying to do. So even if they think that they're going to lose the lawsuit, they still have the FDA's preemption powers to kill what we're trying to do. Which is why what really has to happen is the marketplace has to move. Because they can't legislate against the marketplace movement. Does that make sense? Peter.
Yesterday I was at the co-op shopping, and I was in the cereal aisle, and I noticed a brand of cereal that had a little label on the shelf that said certified GMO free. And I think maybe it's been there a long time, I don't know, but to me it looks like the commercial interest responding to the public interest and really getting out in front of the legislation in a very tiny way in this one particular case. And I think maybe we'll see more of that.
Well, I think we are seeing more of that. So the comment was that new labeling that's saying certified GMO or GE-free has been cropping up more obviously. I think there's no question that more and more businesses are looking at that. It's a business model question. I think it costs $10,000 or so per product to go through the whole verification process, because it's a full supply chain process. We're almost done, I see. Okay. But there's no question that more and more businesses see that as an added value to their product lines that is a competitive advantage on the shelves. And so hopefully all of this energy and the risk that Vermont is taking and other states are taking will lead to changes in the marketplace that will be immune to the political and financial and legal clout, I guess, or power that the industry holds, and we can move forward on being able to make healthy choices for ourselves.
Stay around for a while.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone, we'll take a few seconds if anyone has any announcements for the upcoming. Peter, do you want to talk?
I'd just like to call people's attention to this film on July 14th and 15th. It has to do with an effort by Gun Safe Vermont. It's a free film with the following discussion at the West Village Meeting House.